Hi there. Welcome, everybody. We just wanted to start by saying we're presenting from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As we were introduced, I'm Peter Heinmiller. I'm a principal at Value Advisory Partners.
Yes, and Christopher Marinopoulos. I'm a senior consultant at Value Advisory Partners, and today we're presenting on a really transformative project for regional planning, and it's called the Regional Adaptive Pathways Planning Project, or we'll refer to it as RAPP through the presentation. And in a nutshell, it really is a transformative project that looks into multi-hazard and resilient lens in regional planning. And for this, the context, this one was within the Illawarra Shoalhaven regions, which includes Wollongong, Shellharbour, Kiama, and Shoalhaven LGAs. This was delivered, delivery partners for this project are CSIRO through a lot of the data and analytics, and through the State Department of Planning, Environment, New South Wales, funded by New South Wales Reconstruction Authority and the Commonwealth Government. This project really is understanding what currently has been happening in regional planning and what can be improved under two key axes that we found. So this project really understands incorporating resilience into resilient regional planning rather than having it as a separate entity, but actually being incorporated into the planning processes, stakeholder engagement, and other processes. We also found that through this project, one of the most critical insights and transforming nature was the connective engagement through multiple stakeholders, regional networks, First Nations, public, private, government, and other things. So that was really important, that it was inclusive and accessible for everyone. What we found currently in regional planning practices, especially a lot of regional plans, is that sometimes there is limited integration between local council LGAs. They may have separate plans and they may not be able to discuss together or have an integrated approach. The incorporation of natural disasters can be seen as separate for a lot of the occasions, and multiple hazards really isn't considered a key aspect. Also shorter timeframes and limited incorporation of how we can connect it to global frameworks, measures, and metrics such as UN Sustainable Development Goals. What RAPP is wanting to achieve is actually go through three critical transformative processes to make sure that planning is done in a new way, a new model for regional planning, which incorporates the resilience lens. This includes development of plausible futures, which is through scenarios of growth for a region like this and understanding what are the potential in the long term. Localized multi-hazard assessment, so understand that there's multiple hazards on one region and in a place-based approach and bottom-up. And adaptive pathways, understanding that there isn't just one way or one business as usual approach for regional planning, but you may have to pivot, you may have to be adaptive to needs or new challenges in the future. And this is all underpinned by the connection to an evaluation framework. So in this project, the UN Sustainable Development Goals was a key aspect of monitoring and evaluating the benefits and the success of the project. And this came through planning in context of a global framework, but also the bottom up. So understanding localized and place-based for the Illawarra Shoalhaven. We'll just go over some of the real key challenges for regional planning, some of the highlights that regional planning is actually facing right at the stage, and even more stress into the future. So brought up earlier today a lot about the Regional Institute, where internal migration, net migration is really putting pressure on regions, especially in the housing. Some examples include Illawarra becoming a commuter suburban area of somewhere like Sydney because of the housing affordability and people wanting to have larger properties, more land, as well as the idea of COVID and post-COVID accelerating sea change, tree change, and lifestyle communities really being a popular option for older Australians, but also younger Australians wanting a different lifestyle to the city. Just highlighting the amount of people coming from a lot of Sydney into the Illawarra Shoalhaven, and some examples including infill in places like the CBD or suburban town centres, greenfield in growth areas like Dapto, and lifestyle townships and expanding areas like Mollywood, Ulladulla, and Sussex Inlet. What we find is that there is a need for change from the business as usual approach or the large scale regional approach, but rather going place-based and bottom up. What we found that it's important to understand infrastructure, and the needs of the local communities, local sort of growth areas that are needed to enable growth in a livable manner, rather than putting pressure on growth areas, which is happening in a lot of parts of Australia. And this is also to do with housing affordability as well. We see that this is in the current academic discourse and government discourse. As you can see, one of the key reports that came out last week about pressures on housing in regions, and that there's many levels of planning in regional development, going from state policy right down to precinct plans. Second, a real key addition for this project, which is understanding the challenges that multiple hazards has on a region such as Illawarra Shoalhaven, or this is other parts of Australia, as we've seen with the regional cyclone and ex-tropical cyclone Alfred through many parts of New South Wales, Queensland, inland and coastal. And this really shows that things like bushfire, flooding, storm surge, inundation and landslide can actually be in the same region. So really understanding that these catastrophic events can happen on top of each other, and they can really be catastrophic for a region. So really understanding that you have to consider them all together, rather than just saying, oh, we'll have a bushfire plan, or we'll look into landslides separately. So this is really connecting that to the regional plan.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris is sort of highlighting, there's, in terms of the future housing growth and the uncertainty around multiple hazards affecting the regions, how do we accommodate and understand this uncertainty into the future? And what does it mean for us as planners? And some of the key changes that we want to consider to get those preferable outcomes for our communities use this concept of the futures cone, which highlights potential futures and contextualizes the drivers of change from, you know, the preposterous all the way down to the probable. And some of those changes might be things like population and housing demand, the enabling and supporting infrastructure that those populations will need, climate and hazard, as Chris mentioned, and socioeconomic and technology changes that we might need to think about. And to achieve the preferable and resilient future, we need to have an adaptation perspective on this, and we need to also sort of narrow the focus so we're not considering every single possibility. We're managing uncertainty in a way that can be built into current decision making. So we're just going to talk a little bit about, give an overview of what the RAPP project is. So this was a multi-year, multi-partner, multi-stakeholder project. And the vision for the project was was a process of deliberative collaboration with a really diverse range of stakeholder groups to identify and test options and pathways for planning in the future, and to build a consensus on what solutions might contribute to a more climate adapted, just and disaster resilient futures. And again, those are tied to the SDG goals as an evaluation framework. So we start with a view of risk, which is, you know, hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and the response to any given hazards, and multi-hazards in our case. And then looking at 4 steps in the process. So what are the parameters for change? What is happening currently? And what are the drivers for change? Step 2 is about the desired features. So what do we want the future to look like, and what guiding principles are we going to use to achieve that vision? Step 3 was about plausible futures. So this is what could be. So again, this goes back to the cone of plausibility, looking at potential future change in a manageable way. And lastly, opportunities, what can be. So how do we adjust current planning practice to achieve the desired futures that we're seeking?
Great, thanks, Pete. One of the key transformative processes that were done through the RAPP project was development using the information about scenarios and what is a plausible divergent future. So understanding boundary conditions for actually growth within a region. So this was done through stakeholder engagement and really a bottom-up approach to understand with all these different sort of managing uncertainties. So what things like population growth, is it going to be a low growth or a high growth? Is it going to be high migration, or is it going to be limited? What is the dwelling needs? There's dwelling changes in terms of if it's more infill or greenfield development, and that sort of size of dwelling. Understanding obviously economic development, climate change issues, technology, and population demographics. And one of the key things that we found through this was how stakeholders through First Nations, through the community, also through government, understood that spatial reorganisation of a region such as Illawarra Shoalhaven can range from concentration of CBDs, suburban centres, or it can range from complete distribution of greenfield areas of that focus, or it could have to be just following the current patterns. So those was some real critical insights we got into the place-based approach for these divergent futures. This was looking at more of an overall climate change, so saying there's that, but we've actually looking to, and then looking into the next step is understanding which ones we were going to use as our boundary conditions. So we've chosen these two, but that was done through that stakeholder engagement process to see which one would seem the short list for the next step. One of the key parts of this idea of understanding futures for the region was the accessibility of data. So what we made sure that the whole delivery of the team was to get the best data or the best possible data, understand current dwellings at a place-based level rather than just a regional LGA, and making sure that this was usable and accessible to all stakeholders. So understanding that they can have a look at it, be integrated into this sort of data set and really bring the best together. What we were able to do is understand with those two shortlisted plausible futures is the areas of high growth and where the pressures on housing infrastructure would be. So we were testing whether under a low scenario growth, where the growth would be, so maybe more manageable, or potentially in the high scenario with lots of growth in key growth areas such as, in this example, Shellharbour, Dapto, and some of Wollongong CBD, the housing pressures, the enabling infrastructure that's required. So that was really shown back and forth. It was a back and forth process between stakeholders to understand that this was a big issue, and these sort of modellings really helped in the process of the RAPP. Furthermore, we also made sure that inclusion of localised multi-hazard assessment rather than global measures. So understanding that hazards and exposure and vulnerability are different within different parts of Illawarra Shoalhaven. So some LGAs had bigger issues. If it was landslides or coastal, it could be different sort of issues. And understanding in terms of climate change, how it's affecting the region, what could be some expanded areas where there could be further hazards, and also is there potential new hazards for the region that isn't currently in place at the moment. And we found this was an important one to understand, that local knowledge as well about, understanding not just flood modelling, but people's stories, and also that sort of workshop approach was really critical to this. And again, another example where we used the visualization was getting multiple hazard data sets, which can be quite difficult to get together, bring it together, make it accessible, and really using these in sort of that stakeholder engagement to show, well, this is a developable area, it's got high growth, but it's got multiple hazards. So this really drove the conversation and delivered towards the pathways which we'll go into now.
So what Chris has highlighted is two of the three steps that we went through. So understanding plausible divergent futures, the hazard and multi-hazard view on a localized basis. And that really builds a shared understanding about housing growth and hazard and how these things intersect and how they need to be considered. The third step is about adaptation pathways. So what are they? These are different options or growth housing delivery and dwelling options that can follow different types of pathways. So the degree of hazard is across the top axis, going from medium high to very high, not necessarily temporal, but this is just degree of hazard. And the three options or strategies are increasing dwelling density, maintaining existing dwelling density, or relocating, so through buybacks, for example, and to prevent rebuilding in areas that are at very high risk. The indicators on the diagram here, the circles represent the decision points. So these are points at which a decision process needs to be enacted to reevaluate the suitability of a given option, whether you want to be on the increase, maintain, or relocate pathway. The triggers, those little triangular arrows, are varying degrees of hazard were used as this diagnostic device to say, well, what is our current understanding of future hazards? And what is the probable hazard level under a changing climate? And how do we use those to test whether our pathway is suitable based on a given risk appetite for hazard? And finally, there's the thresholds at the end of those pathways there, which say these are points at which the suitability of a given option, for example, on the top row, increased dwelling density, is no longer feasible or adequate, and an alternative pathway needs to be implemented. So how did this look in the workshops with the various stakeholders? So the choice of what pathway you want to be on, and this is all about the adaptation, depends on the decision maker's level of risk tolerance to hazard impacts. So the current policy pathway has a very low consideration and awareness of future hazard, and under the high and the low plausible divergent features for housing growth would not be able to accommodate that level of growth. That's what we discovered through the process. There was another pathway which could be a high hazard tolerance pathway, meaning you've got a good idea of future hazard and you feel like the modeling is robust enough to enable effective risk mitigation so you can keep increasing dwelling density in those areas. This is sort of a defend strategy. And then lastly, there was a strategy based around a pathway based around a low hazard tolerance. So this is still informed by an improved hazard knowledge, but really focuses housing in areas with low or no hazard susceptibility. So this is a low regrets or no regrets approach to delivering housing in the region. And that kind of all came together in this, and I'm not expecting everyone to kind of go through this step by step. What's important with this is that each pathway and level of risk tolerance needed to be considered against the type of settlement. So some infill with walkable catchments might follow a different pathway. You might choose to defend longer than, for example, in an expanding township that might be at higher risk because it's isolated. And similarly, greenfield areas were also considered under increasing dwelling density and then would transition into one of the other settlement types over time. And these were all evaluated by the stakeholders and discussed about which pathway they would feel most comfortable with based on that level of risk tolerance. So what does this all mean? So out of the whole RAPP process, there was a set of key recommendations that came out of it. And what really emerged and became quite obvious for us was this early and ongoing engagement with stakeholders. This is really about building a strong shared understanding between diverse groups. So as Chris mentioned before, there was a First Nation stakeholder group, a local community stakeholder group, and a government, agency, industry, and academic stakeholder group. And there was several workshops held with each, and all the findings from those were integrated and discussed among the groups, so everyone had a shared perspective. Increasing housing supply was important, but also putting it in safe areas and having it be affordable was also really important. The plan to fund infrastructure, where do we need it? When do we need it? How much do we need? All of these sorts of considerations. Increasing capability and knowledge, particularly in terms of a lot of these concepts like pathways, adaptation pathways. And then of course the governance, cross-sector governance that's risk-informed and integrated into a strategic assessment. So the New South Wales Department of Planning has an ISA, the Integrated Strategic Assessment, that the MH-DORA process, the multi-hazard process, was built into as well. So those are the key recommendations that came out of the project.
Yes, and also out of this project were some insights into how this could be helpful in terms of next steps and opportunities for other regional plans, and throughout Australia, but through other areas. So some of the key ones were an idea of adapting this as a new model for regional planning. So understanding that the hazards, the plausible futures, and the adaptive pathways integrated into regional planning in other areas. And this Pathfinder project really showed that there was possibility that it could be included through the right method. Inclusion within the disaster adaptation plans, given the increased importance of these adaptation plans and understanding that housing and planning is actually should be integrated with these plans as well. So not just separate, but really that sort of incorporation. Understanding that this could be a process, the method could be used within other industries. We focused on housing for this particular project, but employment, industry, land use, agriculture, transport, and regional economics are just some of the examples that could be where this could be put into policy. And finally, the idea of collaboration, not just with government or local government, but also private industry. So developers that are delivering a lot of the growth area, the market, it's really important that these accessible data, workshop outcomes and recommendations are really conveyed all together, so we can have a more cohesive approach to regional planning within the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter and Christopher. Now we have some time for the Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions in the live Q&A chat box to the right. In the meantime, while I wait for a question, Peter and Christopher, I was wondering, has there been any progress or any update from the department or any stakeholders who have expressed interest in this work? Is it currently being implemented?
Yeah, so there was a large body of work to document a lot of the outcomes. That's not just the stakeholder workshop reporting, but the MH-DORA, so the technical report behind all the technical aspects of the project, as well as the department working on some of their own reporting. I'm not certain as to the current status, but the intent was that a lot of this material would be published and shared with other councils and government departments to demonstrate what was done. And again, this was a Pathfinder project, so there was a lot of lessons learned and aspects that certainly you could build upon in the next phase of work. So I know there's the intent to publish, just not exactly sure on the timing at this point.
No worries. Thanks for the insight. I've got a question here from Morteza. Morteza asks, thanks for the insight presentation. One of the challenges for local councils is balancing multiple hazards or hazards with non-hazards. For example, how can they enhance habitat connectivity and vegetation along corridors while minimizing bushfire risks? Another challenge is overcoming implementation barriers such as community angst over updated flood maps. Do you have any comments on these?
Yeah, certainly. So as part of the project, many of the participants came up with opportunities to build value and to build resilience in their communities, really localized in a place-based way. So some of those examples were things like new vegetation or vegetation clearing, depending on the level of risk and what you're trying to mitigate against. So it wasn't just about pure mitigation, it was about opportunities to make these better places to live and build resilience in some of those other SDG goals, accessibility and amenity and some of those livability measures. So I think as part of the process, it's important to acknowledge the interaction of these things. Yeah. So it's something else that we touched on here is that there is a level of interaction between hazards. So they were overlaid in this project. So we had the different hazard layers, but what wasn't really done is a discussion of, well, what about the cascading and compounding impacts? What about heavy rains create more vegetation, which increases bushfire risk in the future if things get dry. So there's a lot of complexity that needs to be discussed and addressed. And I think that stakeholder consultation process is a really important forum to enable those conversations to happen between, hey, we have this great opportunity here, but there is a risk or a disbenefit to implementing that, depending on the level of hazard risk and the level of community support.
Great, thank you. Tiffany is asking, is projected climate change sea rise considered directly in your modelling?
Yeah. So that was one of the hazards was definitely about coastal inundation. So we have some, obviously a lot of erosion from a lot of the beaches, but also places like Lake Illawarra in that region is a real key example of where that's occurring. And it's really that was included within the mapping, but there was also riverine flooding as well, and obviously at the other hand. So those sort of intersections were really critical, and really through that sort of stakeholder engagement said, rather than just the data itself, but there's actually sort of real stories about where there's been changes or challenges for these sort of things. And yeah, sea level rise is definitely one. And multi-hazards can be, there's quite a lot, but at the first 4 or 5, but even that stage was really beneficial to have that connection between the two, and the communities especially that live on the coastal where sea level rise is a big issue.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we were limited in what hazard data was available and what we could use. So we had data from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, the Department of Planning and Environment for flood and estuarine inundation, and we had some work that was licensed from the University of Wollongong to understand landslide. So really those 4 hazards, bushfire, flood, estuarine flood, and landslide, were the ones that we're really focused on, because they were the ones we had available data for. But certainly there's other considerations, and this is where a lot of the participants in the workshops were interested in developing a shared understanding of hazard risk through a database or a portal or some a structured common source of truth, if you want to call it that, about understanding that hazard risk. So that's a work in progress, and there's a lot of work being done there, but it's incredibly complex and challenging.
Fantastic. Thank you both, Christopher and Peter, for your insights. And thank you everyone for joining us today for our concurrent session and for the amazing questions. We now have another 30-minute coffee break.